You're listening to Speaking Sidemount, the podcast where we talk all things sidemount diving, from equipment, skills, techniques, and sidemount diving expeditions to interviews with some of the world's top sidemount divers. Whether you're new to sidemount, been sidemount diving for years, or just want to know more, this is the place for all things sidemount. I'm your host, Steve Davis. Let's get wet. Welcome back to Speaking Sidemount. I'm Steve Davis. This episode is sponsored by X-Deep. My sincere thanks to Pieter, Magda, Bart, and the amazing team at X-Deep for their support of this podcast and for continuing to develop such amazing products to support our diving. You'll know for sure about the Stealth 2.0 series of sidemount systems, which I have dived for over 6 years now, but look out for some stunning new product releases with their new regulators and mask soon to be available. Like I'm sure many of you are, I'm an absolute junkie when it comes to dive equipment, and I can't wait for these new releases. Now, just over a year ago, the world watched with trepidation and then with awe as a group of cave divers from around the world, along with a cast of literally thousands, including the local community and the Thai and US military, achieved the impossible and rescued 12 young boys and their coach from the Tham Luang cave in northern Thailand. In the time since the rescue, there have been numerous news reports, interviews, TV documentaries, movies in progress, and of course we covered this when I spoke with Eric Brown on his experiences during the rescue in episode 14 of Speaking Sidemount. Front and centre in the rescue was Australian cave explorer and anaesthetist Richard Harry Harris and his dive partner Craig Challen. Since the rescue, Harry and Craig have received numerous awards, including being named Joint Australians of the Year, and on November 5, we're going to see the release of their book, Against All Odds, describing Harry and Craig's experiences during the rescue. Now, due to an embargo around the book release, we can't go into the cave rescue in any detail. That will be for another episode, so look out for that in November. But in a way, this is great, because there is so much more to Harry than his amazing efforts in Thailand. He's a consummate cave diver, an explorer in the true sense of the word, and a man that is truly driven to go where no human has been before. Along with Craig, he has progressively built his cave diving skill set to where they are now successfully accomplishing dives that seem ridiculously difficult. And along the way, Harry has been able to remain his own man. Really will you meet a nicer person, always smiling and willing to share his passion for diving, as I experienced in truck last year when I was introduced to Harry to chat about sidemount rebreathers. We spent an hour or so talking about that and also some of his amazing dives in Pearse Resurgence here in New Zealand. It's truly an honour to share this episode with you. My only regret is I stuffed up and neglected to ask him to share his deep knowledge of sidemount rebreathers. I'll correct that in the next interview for sure. In this episode, Harry and I discuss how he got into diving, how he subsequently grew into cave diving and exploration, the connection between anaesthesiology and diving, how the cave exploration group, the Wet Mules, was formed. Harry shares his experiences diving to over 220 metres in Pearse Resurgence, his partnership with Craig Challen, and how being named Joint Australian of the Year has affected his life, and how he is now using this platform to promote outdoor and adventure pursuits to our kids. All this and much, much more in this episode of Speaking Sidemount. Harry, welcome to Speaking Sidemount.
Thanks, Steve. Good to be chatting with you.
As I tell everyone, you and I go way back. And when I say way back, June last year, Truck Lagoon, we're sitting down having a beer and having dinner, and you graciously gave me a heap of your time to talk over and educate me on sidemount rebreathers. And then I managed to plug you about your experiences diving Pearse Resurgence in New Zealand. Yeah, little did we know, only a few weeks later, you'd be front and center on one of the world's greatest modern time rescues. We need to disclose now that we can't go into the Thai cave rescue in this particular episode because of your upcoming book release, but I'm hoping to get you back in October, November. But, I mean, there's so much we can cover outside of that. And so perhaps to get started, can you share a little about your background in diving? How did you get started as a diver?
Oh, I started as a very young boy, actually. My family, I was very lucky to grow up in a family who had family friends who were all into boating and fishing, and, you know, all our summer holidays were coastal and water related. And when I was about 13 years old, I was lucky to meet a family friend called Pat Harbison, who was a marine biologist.
Yep.
And this lady just was one of those sort of very quiet but very clever people who influence young people without them really realising what's happening. And I'd been out spearfishing one day, and we're all back on the beach, and I laid out very proudly my catch of reef fish, which are all very beautiful but completely inedible. And so one by one she went through these fish with me and said, "No, tell me, Richard, what's this one here?" And I said, "Oh, I think it's a zebra fish." And, "Oh, okay. And do you know what they eat?" "No, not really, Mrs. Harbison." And "what are you going to do with it?" I hadn't really thought about that. And so this little light bulb went on in my brain that maybe there's more to this than just murdering the sea life, and maybe I should learn a bit more about them. So that was sort of when I first started to get this interest in the ocean, and it was all down to this one very smart lady who gave me an important lesson on the beach that day. Anyway, she also had a hooker, so a little compressor on the boat and a bit of a hose down the side of the boat, and we used to just go diving on that under their sort of vague supervision. They'd be up on the boat, and we'd be sending up oysters and scallops, and they'd be sitting there, and the shells would float down past us, and they'd be having a tonic up in the boat.
Yes.
And so that was my first introduction to breathing underwater, really with no instruction or tuition. So, you can get lucky and survive these things sometimes. I was just hooked, I just had to do my course as soon as possible. I had to wait till I was about 15 years old, so that was 1979, and went to the local dive shop, and I was pestering them, "Come on, let me do my course, come back next year," sort of thing. Anyway, when I was 15, they finally let me in the door, and so that's when I did my open water course, which was a FOWI open water course. I was very proud to be part of the Federation of Australian Underwater Instructors back then. The training was really thorough, really robust, and I just loved it. And so I went on with my local metropolitan, open water diving, local reefs and wrecks. Started photography quite soon after that. Me and a friend went halves in a Konos 2 or 3, I can't remember which, and black and white film, and I used to develop that in my dad's cellar, so before I developed an appreciation for wine. And so I blacked out the windows of his cellar and turned it into a developing darkroom. And so I've got all these dreadful black and white photos of silhouettes of fish, and so I've still got some of those. Then when I was at uni at medical school, I joined the Flinders University Dive Club, and that was a really awesome club, very active, over 100 members, a couple of different boats, and a few of us became instructors in the club, open water instructors. So I got to meet, some dive professionals then who were teaching us how to be instructors, and yeah, that's when I really probably took it up a notch, I guess.
Yep.
And then after a couple of years of that, a few of us said, "Well, what about this cave diving caper?" So we all went down to Mount Gambier in about 1985 and gave that a shot. And it was a bit of a false start for me, actually, the cave diving, because I didn't really love it. It was July in Mount Gambier. It was wet, raining, pretty miserable. I was in my old Moray wetsuit, and I thought, why would you do this?
Stuff. I just got back from there, as you might know, and it was June. I was on a dry suit and it was still cold, hey?
Yeah. So I didn't really take to it straight away. And the other problem was a lot of the good sites were closed. So Picanee Ponds was closed back then because of a concern about impact to the aquatic plants from diving, which probably turned out to be a furphy. I think it was just a normal cyclical change in the plants there.
Right.
So we didn't really get to dive anything nice. And I went, "You can have this." And I went back to my ocean diving.
Yeah.
And it wasn't about the year 2000 that I gave cave diving another try and got into some nice sites like Kilsby Sinkhole and Picks. And then I was like, wow, what have I been doing? I've been really missing out. So I felt like I missed 15 really good years there when lots of interesting exploration, particularly out on the Nullarbor, was being done. And I absolutely kicked myself now.
As we both well know, that's far, far from finished though, right?
Oh, sure. Yeah, plenty more to do. But yeah, it just seems like a missed chance in a way, but that's life.
Yeah, I hear you. And the same for me. I mean, I got into cave diving very late. I'd been diving for 30 years before I started cave diving. It's outrageous not to know about that and not to be able to experience it when you're a younger diver. So if you're a young diver out there listening and you're not into cave diving yet, boy, at least go and check it out, right?
Don't waste any time. It's the best.
Indeed. What led from this initial cave diving experience to you becoming an explorer? How did that happen?
I fell in with a bad crowd, I'd say.
Okay.
Well, no, it's not quite true. So I had an amazing opportunity quite early on. So after 2000, I went back and trained again. I just didn't take it for granted that I would know what I was doing. And I just got a dry suit and I thought, really, I'm pretty hopeless as a diver still. So I went back, did it was called cabin sinkhole at that stage. Whereas when I first did it, of course, it was category 1, category 2, and then category 3, which I hadn't done. So I went back with a couple of mates. I dragged down there and retrained myself with a very well-known pair of instructors, Gary Barclay and Linda Claridge, who were fabulous.
Mm-hmm.
Lucky I did, because, I was upside down half the time in my dry suit and in the silk the rest of the time. So that was a really important course for me to do. It really took me down a notch and made me realise I had no idea what I was doing, even after being an ocean diver for many years.
Mm-hmm.
And I enjoyed that so much, I went on and did my cave course. And then just after that, I started diving rebreathers. So that was about 2002, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd met up with John Dallazwana, JDZ, who was just really getting started in rebreathers himself a couple of years before that, I think. Mm-hmm. And him and a couple of other guys, Chris Law and a fella from Queensland, Kerry McKenzie or Tubby McKenzie, had been playing around with these Drager Dolphin semi-closed rebreathers, but converting them to fully closed. And what these guys developed was this kiss valve type assembly, a little needle valve that they cut up and brazed together a couple of different components and a clipboard valve and something else to make basically a needle valve and a manual flush button for oxygen and closed circuit conversions for these Dolphin rebreathers. And they were doing some great diving on them. I mean, they dived the bayonet out off Melbourne, in the ship's graveyard, which is 85 metres deep. I mean, they're pretty out there on these homemade little things.
Sure.
So when I saw this thing that JDZ showed me down at Mount Gambier one day, as an anaesthetist, I just recognised it for what it was. I mean, it's an anaesthetic machine, except, instead of putting drugs, you're putting a bit of oxygen and air in there.
Okay.
And it just sort of immediately made sense to me. I thought, oh yeah, this is the way forward for me. So I raced home to my shed and built my own rebreather, built my own KISS-style rebreather.
That's the way.
And it worked. And fortunately, I didn't dive it very much because I'm a doctor, not a engineer. Many of my friends would say so. But I proved to myself the concept and that I understood basically the gas pathways and what was involved. So I dismembered that horrible death machine and threw all the parts in different bins so it could never come back together again. Yes. And went out and bought myself a KISS Classic, which at that stage you could just pretty much order over the internet as a set of parts. Gordon Smith, the originator of KISS rebreathers, was an amazing guy, and the principle of this very simple rebreather was that you really had to understand what you were doing to buy the kit and put it together and start diving it safely, I think.
Right.
Now, in retrospect, maybe that wasn't a great plan and not the way forward for rebreather training and safety, but it was a really good way to kickstart my rebreather career without having to jump through too many hoops. And again, I wouldn't recommend this path for anyone, but I felt that, with my sort of intuitive understanding of how the loop works and my background in anaesthesia, I felt that it was a reasonable thing for me to be doing.
How much did you do on your own versus with JDZ?
Probably too much.
Yeah.
But then I did start to, meet up with like-minded guys like John. Mm-hmm. And I did go and do a course of sorts. I won't say who with, but it was a bit rudimentary, but got myself a card.
Yes.
And then I went off to Vanuatu for 2 years, and that was just perfect timing for my diving career because suddenly I was in the tropics with both some deep ocean walls to start progressing my build-ups for deep diving, and also a country full of unexplored caves. And I was really the only cave diver in the country at the time for 2 whole years. I made very good friends with a guy called Barry Holland, who was running Aquamarine Dive Shop with Kevin Green up in Espiritu Santo.
Yes.
So I went up there at every opportunity and dived my KISS Classic on the Coolidge and some other wrecks out there. Mm-hmm. And then dragged Barry out into the bush to dive amazing caves like the Sarikata Resurgence, which is kilometres of flowing Resurgence cave and still has ongoing exploration. So suddenly I had this bug for unexplored caves, and I had all these caves at my doorstep that I could pop out on weekends and start ferreting around. So that's when I really got the bug.
Sounds amazing. You mentioned a couple of times being an anaesthesiologist. There's a few other prominent tech divers like from New Zealand, Dr. Simon Mitchell, who also shares your profession. Is that a coincidence or is there a genuine connection between the two?
Well, you often find diving and hyperbaric physicians come from a background of anaesthesia.
Yes.
And also from occupational medicine, military medicine, and a little bit less perhaps in emergency medicine.
Right.
So I don't know, it's gases and it's pressures and it's physics. It sort of all makes sense to us, I guess, and that draws us to those specialties. And there are certainly quite a few anaesthetists who are technical divers like Simon, Andrew Fock, and got a few mates in Adelaide who are anaesthetists who enjoy a bit of cave diving and rebreather diving. There's Andy Pitkin in Florida, who's a professor of anaesthesiology there, who's a world-class explorer over in that area. Him and Cast Underwater Research doing amazing stuff. So, yeah, there's a few anaesthetists around. I've got another mate in Germany, in Berlin, who's kind of like my doppelganger. He works in aeromedical retrieval, diving medicine and anaesthesia. So he likes his cave diving and rebreather diving. Seems a bit of an association there.
Yeah, I guess I have a similar thing as an engineer as well. Understanding the physics takes you a long way to understanding diving, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it helps. And I always wonder how people who don't have any kind of technical background come to rebreather diving or mixed gas diving, and if it's more of a struggle for them to get their head around the principles. But just having that feel of what's going on inside the loop, I find very reassuring after years of staring at an anaesthetic monitor where we can actually measure every little gas that's in there, whether it's oxygen levels, carbon dioxide levels, the anaesthetic agents themselves, the nitrous oxide. You know, if you stare at that machine and you adjust your flows up and down and, you know, you vent the thing and you do various things that you can do on a rebreather, very quickly you get a sense of what to expect before you look at the monitor. And that very much applies to rebreather diving, so that if you look at your handset and the PO2 is not what you're expecting, then you immediately question what's going on. Now, I'm not saying any of this is foolproof, obviously, but it just kind of made sense to me. So I felt comfortable on rebreathers early on.
You're a member of the Wet Mules. So can you share a little bit about that group? Obviously, the name itself is super interesting.
Well, they're a fairly appalling bunch of reprobates from around Australia, and I wouldn't encourage anyone to aspire to their low levels. Look, it all started with one of our very good friends, Ken Smith, who is trained in physics by background. He started out as a physics teacher, and now he works for a company that analyses various sort of continuous analysis stuff with lasers and isotopes and things that I wouldn't even pretend to understand. But anyway, he's got a planet-sized brain is the bottom line. He knows about atoms, so we call him a nuclear physicist. He was in part of the USA once doing some work with a coal analyzer, and the American guy he was chatting to, was impressed that Ken could do so much travelling with his work, and he said, "Ken, man, you must have enough money to burn a wet mule." And Ken thought that was a very funny expression. So he kind of told us this story one night. We're sitting around the campfire at the Pearse Resurgence in New Zealand, where it can be, as you know, over there a little bit drizzly and miserable with the sandflies biting, and you're feeling a bit damp and sore. And someone said, "You know what? I reckon we're like wet mules, aren't we? We're always sort of cold and miserable, and we must be stupid to be doing this, but we must also be quite stubborn and have quite strong backs." So we sort of just thought, we are like wet mules, aren't we? And so we just, it just started as a joke. And then we had a delayed flight in the airport. So we started building a website in the airport. And before we knew it, it was just out of hand. It became a thing when it was just a joke. So there were about 6 of us in the first place, and certainly don't take ourselves too seriously. But it's fun to have a little name for.
I think so. And the analogies go on and on. You can imagine carting gear from sump to dry passage and having the same analogy as well. So, I hear you.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, you mentioned Pearse Resurgence, and that was sort of part of our discussion last year when we were talking in truck. And I knew about the story. I mean, the ultimate story of you turning a dive at, 217 meters, part of your DPV imploded. And that was stunning enough, but it was just enthralling to hear how you managed the problems and risks associated with that dive. And I was also really interested in how you did the decompression. Can you recount a little bit about your experience from your last trip there and any future plans that you have?
Yeah, well, I'll just tell you maybe a little bit about the history of the site from my point of view. I first went there in 2007. I was very lucky to, I don't know if I got invited or I invited myself. I often seem to sort of invite myself on these things, so I'm a bit shameless like that. So a guy called Dave Appley, who was one of the first technical divers of the year from the Oztech conference, amazing guy. He and a fella called Tim Cashman, a Welshman, were diving the Niagara, the wreck off Auckland, which is, as you know, a Royal Mail steamship from World War II, which hit a German mine and sunk with about 4.5 tons, I think, of gold bars in the strong room. So that is an amazing shipwreck to dive, and probably the best technical shipwreck dive in New Zealand and maybe Australia, I don't know. It's in about 120 metres of water, so it's it's a big dive, and made more so by the conditions out off that coast, which are often a bit gnarly.
Yeah.
So Dave Apley and Tim, and I'm not sure if Pete Mesley was involved in the very first dives, but he certainly did quite a lot subsequently. Anyway, these guys were out there, and then Tim and Dave went to this place called the Pearse Resurgence for a bit of a dive as well.
Mm-hmm.
And they started exploring this very cold freshwater spring in the Kaharangi National Park, west of Nelson. And they started to make some real inroads into it. And Dave became pretty obsessed with this project and kept going back and back with a bunch of guys from Sydney as well. And he was down at about 125 metres into this cave and reached a thing called the Big Room. And he kind of got stuck there. He couldn't sort of see if there was a way on. In fact, what he was looking at, which he thought was a black wall in front of him, was just a void, as it turned out. But he got a bit held up at that point. So he set up a trip over there in 2007, and Rick Stanton, the very famous cave diver from the UK, was invited, and another very well-known wreck diver called Craig Challen from Victoria, and myself. So we rocked up to the Pearse Resurgence, and was Craig there? I think Craig was there. Anyway, so we came along, and Stanton got his homemade rebreather, which seriously looked like something from Bunnings, just whatever your equivalent is, the hardware store.
We've got
and this thing looks appalling, and he jumps in the water and says, "See you, lads," and he comes back after a 177 metre dive down past the Big Room, down this huge passageway that we called the M40 after Rick's highway at home.
Yeah.
Comes back after this little casual dive down to 177 metres and said, "Oh, yeah, she goes." I was just like, oh, my God, I'm dealing with something that's so outside my experience here. I'd been diving up to that point, maybe 140 metres in the tropics, warm water, some 110, 120 metre wreck dives. But this cave is formidable. It's very dark, marble. It's so deep, so cold, 6 degrees. Suddenly you're in dry gloves, everything's hard, you're wearing all these extra layers of undergarments, and psychologically it is a really intimidating sight, especially the first couple of times you go there. Right. So for this bloke to rock up with this thing that looked like a drain pipe strapped to his side and pop down to 177, I just realised that I was just not in the same league as these guys, and had some serious thinking to do about my diving if I was ever going to amount to much. So it was a really humbling experience, it's fair to say. So I did a dive to about 135 in that site and flooded my suit and got nicely bent out of it. So that was a bit of fun. Didn't end up in the chamber. Fortunately, it sort of got better with some first aid, as you do in remote locations. There aren't too many options sometimes. Yeah, I went away sort of scratching my head and said, what just happened? And that had really sowed the seeds that this was something I wanted to pursue and go back and try and not conquer, but certainly master at least my own terror about this place.
Well, I guess an experience like that's a bit of a nexus, isn't it? You're either going to carry on or you're going to stop at that point, aren't you?
Yeah. I mean, diving in the presence of someone like Rick was just an absolute eye-opener for me because, he's been doing stuff like that for at least 10 years before this time. Right. And this was an average day out for him. And so when your whole paradigm shifts like that, where you think, I've been doing some cool stuff, and then someone comes along and does that in front of you and you go, right, that's what a real diver looks like. I hadn't realised. So I was really inspired by that trip and have been going back as many times as possible thereafter. So I've probably done about another 7 trips. And I guess what I'd say to people about that sort of diving is that I then kind of did go back to square one a little bit and build up pretty incrementally. So we took on board all the technology and the techniques that Rick and Dave showed us, because they had a habitat in the cave, which I'd never used before. They just had a single habitat in at about 7 metres. So I went back and did that the next year, and I got down to 182 metres, just with a very small team, probably pretty underdone actually. I was a bit under-supported. I just didn't have the right people there. Yeah. And then managed to convince a few more guys to come back after that, and guys like Craig Challen and the other wet mules, Ken and JDZ and Dave and Sandy. And they all got stuck into it too, and we started doing some pretty good dives in there. And Craig started to share this obsession slowly but surely. Craig Challen started to get on board. Although I remember him, and he was a diver that I really respected. Like, he was way ahead of me in his cave diving for sure.
Right.
And he came to this cave, and I remember him saying something along the lines of that, well, I've just had my ass whipped or something. The first impression of this cave is always like, whoa, that is a full-on place. So I think most cave divers have a little bit of a re-evaluation of their skills after their first dive in the Pearse, because it's hard. It's really hard place. You stand and he just swims around.
Yeah. And as you say, I mean, when you think about the background that Rick and other similar level members from the CDG go through, where they're diving cold water in the UK all the time, he's travelled the world. And again, it's not something that Rick's just jumped into either, right? He built his experience incrementally.
Yeah.
Those are guys you can follow. And so you mentioned Craig, and you've formed a really strong diving partnership with Craig. Can you share a bit about that?
Yeah, well, after I came back from Vanuatu at the end of 2005, I think I'd met him at an Oztec around that time anyway. I popped over from Vanuatu for one of the Oztecs. Again, one of these expeditions I might have invited myself on. Paul Hosey was diving an amazing sinkhole out in the Kimberleys, very remote place called Kidja Blue. Mm-hmm. And he planned a trip to there for 2006. So I managed to get myself an invite onto that one. And JDZ, Craig, and Ken Smith, another guy called Steve James from Western Australia, all really great guys. And so we did this trip, and it was the first experience we had of diving and camping with a helicopter flying us in. Obviously, with New Zealand, that's become fairly standard for us, but this was our first experience of helicopters. And I remember we were so terrified as to how much it was going to cost that we did, people do ultra lightweight hiking and cut their toothbrushes in half and things. That's the way we approached this whole expedition. So it was rebreathers only, a couple of G's of oxygen, bit of helium, bit of sorb. There was no room for any food or anything after that. So it was just sleeping bags on a tarp sort of approach, and little tiny Primus stoves, and very little of value nutritionally, and maybe one carton of beer between us for the whole trip. Very desperate. We'd never do that again.
That sounds shocking.
We just spend the money now, mate. The beer is as much as you need. So that was an extraordinary trip, and I dived with all those guys really on the trip. But Craig and I struck up quite a friendship. Clearly, I was starting to develop this idea that I enjoyed deeper diving, and Craig was definitely of a similar mindset. Other guys I find are not that interested in depth. Like Paul Hosey is just probably the best cave explorer this country's ever produced, but he would much prefer a cave that's 10 kilometres long and 5 metres deep, rather than one that's a kilometre long and 200 metres deep. And it's much more sensible. It's very much more reward for your investment to dive like him. But for some reason, Craig and I are just a bit obsessed by these deeper caves. And I think the reason is that I just enjoy the physiological and technological obstacles that you have to think about and overcome to do them safely. Yeah. I enjoy the intellectual process that is involved in doing this as safely as possible. Yeah. Horses for courses, anyway.
Yeah, I sensed that from you when we were discussing it. It seemed like you enjoyed the problem solving. When we talked about Pearse Resurgence, it was, we had to solve this problem to actually achieve the depths, and then to manage the decompression on the way back, you had to solve the problems of how you would manage the habitats, how you would get in them. It seemed as if that was what lit you up.
Yeah, definitely. And particularly with the cold water in that site, you can't do a 13-hour dive without multiple habitats. You just can't, I can't survive. So, I can do 4 hours, maybe 4.5 in that water, and then I am really miserable, even with heating and all my best underpants on. So I am not good at cold at all. Whereas Craig is much tougher with that, and Dave and Sandy are on another level again. They're just, Dave Barty and Sandy Barron. They did a 7.5-hour dive in there once without using the habitat. They were sitting underneath it, and I'm thinking, why? I said, no, we were fine. Honestly, they're on another level of toughness. So I've got to work out how I can do these things, accepting we've all got particular strengths and weaknesses, and the cold water is not my strength at all.
Yeah, go and live in Canada for a few years, then maybe that'll get you around it, huh?
Yeah, I don't know. Get fatter, that seems to help a bit, but introduce other issues.
Exactly. Carrying on with Craig, you were both joint Australian of the Year for this year. How's your life changed since being given this award?
Probably be easier to say, is there anything still the same as it was before? Because that's a much shorter list. Yeah, life is totally, totally different.
Yeah.
13 months ago, around the time I met you, I was working very, very hard, very long hours, not doing enough diving for that reason.
Yeah.
But enjoying my work life and family and things. And then Thailand happened, and we honestly didn't realise the size of the story. We didn't realise how many people around every corner of the world were watching what was happening with those boys.
Yes.
And of course, once we were in Thailand, we were completely oblivious to that because we were just head down in the cave and doing our thing. And we didn't really think it was a big deal. I know that sounds maybe a bit trite or false modesty or whatever, but I think, when you're just working as part of a big team in a situation like that, you don't really think it's anything particularly special. You're just happy when it works. And then you come home and you think, well, that's the end of that. That was a really interesting experience. I was very proud to be part of that amazing team of people.
Mm.
But you think that'll be it. Life will be back to normal in a few days. And I got back on a Friday night, and I think I planned to go back. I thought I'd have a long weekend and then go back to work on the Tuesday, and which I did. But then all the media is suddenly sniffing around the house, and people want to get me on telly, and then we went and got a medal for being involved, and then South Australian of the Year, and then Australians of the Year. My idea of just hiding away from the media and not engaging, well, it only lasted so long, and then we've kind of had to just roll over and get amongst it. But really, since the Australian of the Year, you have to embrace that award because it's an amazing honour, and it comes with not an expectation that you'll go out and inspire the country, but certainly there's a feeling within yourself that, there's an obligation that you got to step up a bit. If the public have nominated you and then you get this award, you feel like you should go out and tell your story and try and, well, in my case, inspire some kids to get outside and take some risks and have some adventures.
Yeah, that was really my next question because, you won Australian of the Year on the back of the achievement in Thailand, which was phenomenal in its own right. But I think you also won it when people dug a bit deeper and looked at the other things you were doing, the things we've been talking about. The exploration and getting out and doing things that very few people on the planet can do, going places that in many cases nobody's been there before, right? So using this platform to promote exploration and getting out there for younger people is just enormous. So tell us a bit about that, because in this day and age with technology, that's a real issue, isn't it?
Well, I think so. I look around me and it's very easy for every generation to think the younger generation are weak and worthless and will never amount to much. And I'm sure my father thought that of us and his father before him. But I think something has actually changed with this current generation, and that is, the technology, social media, smartphones, which have only been around since about 2007. So that is a very short time for what is a very massive change in the appearance of our society. And, I'm seeing kids and meeting kids through some of the charity stuff I'm doing that basically don't have any actual friends. They've only got virtual friends.
Yes.
They live in their little world on their screen, like we are right now, Steve. Instead of being outside kicking the footy, they're playing games online and killing their little mates and sneaking up on them and doing whatever. And they're sort of friendships, but they're not real friendships.
No.
And, if you can't get on your bike and go to your mate's house who lives down the road and pick him up and go up to the park and, make a dam and catch some tadpoles or, jump your bike over a homemade ramp and have a few prangs and get a few stitches, then if you can't even explore your local environment because you're trapped inside or your mum's too scared to let you go outside because of some perception that there's predators or the roads are too busy or all the other things that stops parents letting their kids off the leash these days, I think your brain stops developing. You need to stimulate your brain through outdoor adventuring, and you need to actually take risks, because if you don't take risks, you don't grow. And so I'm very fearful for it. Not all of them, obviously, but a small group of the next generation who are really restricting their personal growth and development. And, bad things happen to us all at some point in life. And if you've been nested in cotton wool for all your life, when the time comes to face up to the fact that you're not the best at everything, you've just been rejected for that first job interview, or someone tells you the blunt truth about yourself, you're going to fold up and collapse in a ball and suck your thumb. So, I think we need to keep it up to kids, keep them getting out there and just harden them up a little bit.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And I think in this day and age, and even in I guess our time, I mean, some of that came through sport, but we just didn't have this access to technology. And you might remember this too. This generation, while they're very susceptible to that, we were too. I remember to this day that first ping pong game that you could plug into your television set in the 70s, and how enthralled I was with that and how enthralled I was with Space Invaders. We'd go to the local arcade. I'm not any different as a human being, nor I'm sure neither are you, than they are. It's just the access to this technology and how compelling it is. And I think, it's people like you as role models who can inspire them to say, okay, hey, that has a place in my life, but so should these other things. And perhaps, I can get out and find some balance in my life and enjoy, because our planet's under some pressure at the moment too. Who knows how long we can enjoy some of the things that we currently enjoy. I hope for a long time. But we've got to really cherish what we've got. And the only way we can cherish it is by being out there and experiencing it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, those games, that technology is so addictive for some people. And I remember it myself, that exact thing. Went to my cousin's place and he had the ping pong with the two bats going up like this, ping pong, ping pong. Exactly. We spent hours on it, and it was just such a waste of a day.
Yeah, we did, and it was such a ridiculous, simple game, and yet we did that.
Yep.
So imagine, some of the immersive games they have now and how compelling that is. So that's what we're up against.
I agree. Yeah, I agree. No argument from me.
And I mean, we talked about outdoors, so I mean, just sort of carrying that a bit further. I mean, I played a lot of sport, but one of the things that really inspired me, like you, was diving. Getting out and experiencing the water. And there's no way that any game could replicate the experience of being in the water and diving. I just couldn't imagine that. And so perhaps this is something that we can promote as well, as getting more people into experiencing the ocean environment or experiencing our freshwater systems, and whether that be ponds, rivers, lakes, whatever, or caves, because I found that just as compelling in the end.
Yeah, and the thing about adventuring is it's exercise. The other big part of this is the obesity epidemic and the health implications of obese kids. If you start life obese as a young person, it's very hard to escape that later in life, because we all end up with a bit of middle-age spread if we're not careful after the sort of age of 30 or 40. So if you start out chubby, then you're behind the eight ball. If you have bad dietary habits because you're sitting watching your screen all day, then that's a really bad way to start. So that's the other side of this. From
your point of view, there's the inspirational aspect of what you're doing, and I'm sure you're talking to kids and so on, but I think there also needs to be some influence over parents. You would sort of mention mums being afraid due to the bad stories in the media and so on. As a parent, what do you think parents should do to encourage their kids to get out more and perhaps enjoy
Well, it's really hard. It's really hard. And as you say, my target audience probably actually isn't kids, because kids are kids. They haven't really changed. It's how they develop and what they're surrounded by. So it is probably actually young parents I really need to address. And I'm kind of talking to them when I'm talking to the kids, of course.
Yeah.
Look, simple things like letting your kids ride their bikes to school, that sort of twice daily enforced exercise, and the opportunity to hang with your mates a bit after school and ride home a bit of a circuitous route and probably play up a little bit. I mean, all the stuff that kids shouldn't do, but it's actually really important that they do get a chance to do and find their boundaries and, give themselves a little bit of a fright now and again and cross the line. Even in my family, we became concerned about letting the kids ride their bikes to school because of the traffic that's so different to when we were kids.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's just important that we let them there wherever possible.
Yeah. Okay. Now, I read yesterday, I think you've also been working to raise the profile of Australian explorer Sir Hubert Wilkins. Obviously, he's not that well known in Australia, although he should be, and I'm guessing he's definitely not known globally. So tell us a bit about his achievements.
Well, he's actually very well known in the USA, so they've celebrated his life enormously. But yeah, this guy who was from South Australia and was around in the World War I era initially as a wartime photographer and cinematographer. He was out there with a guy called Frank Hurley out on the Western Front.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Frank had already or subsequently did also do a lot of polar imaging. He was the one who took those amazing images of Shackleton's ship entrapped in the ice, I recall.
Right.
So Hubert Wilkins was just a Renaissance man. He had a finger in so many pies. He was a polar explorer himself. He became an aviator, which he used to do a lot of his exploration. He was an extraordinary navigator. He did a dead reckoning navigation flight from, I think it was from Alaska to Norway across the North Pole. Wow. In fact, when he came home, and you can picture him in his open cockpit plane, these big mittens on and things, writing notes and trying to use a sextant and doing all those terrible computations to navigate his way by dead reckoning. Apparently when he got back to and finished the flight, the establishment said, well, that's just impossible. You're a fraud. That could not be done. They got all these experts to examine all his notes and things and went, oh, okay, maybe you did do it. Just no one could believe that was possible. So he was exceptional in that regard. He recognised that the polar regions probably were the kind of engine room for global climate. And because of him, there's meteorological stations in the Arctic and the Antarctic. So that kind of set the scene for the concept of climate change in a way, knowing that climate is a global phenomenon, not just a local or regional phenomenon. He was very outspoken about Indigenous rights at a time when that was very inappropriate in Australia. It was politically incorrect to be pro-Indigenous people and advocated strongly for them. So he was very much his own man. He spoke his mind. He was just an amazing guy. He decided to take a submarine under the North Pole if he could, which failed terribly, but he proved that it sort of could be done. He didn't get as far as the North Pole, but he did get the sub under the ice. And the Americans thought so highly of him that they subsequently took one of their nuclear subs under the North Pole, popped it up through the ice and held a ceremony in his honour. In fact, they may have put his ashes up there, and they've done that a couple of times in his name. So he's a slightly interesting character because he's also got a bit of a fun, odd side to him. He was a bit interested in ESP and sort of not supernatural stuff, but the mystical side of life. And I think he consulted fortune tellers and things. So an amazing scientist, but at the same time trying to explore the paranormal and other aspects of sort of pseudoscience. So maybe that didn't do him any favours in some regards.
Sure.
But, General Monash, the Australian leader on the Western Front, said that Hubert Wilkins was the bravest man he'd ever met, and he got a military cross and then a bar to his military cross. And he had never carried a weapon. He was just out there with his camera and helped bring some injured people back to the line. And he was almost immortal, according to the troops out there. He got blown up and shot and shrapnelled about 10 times and never could seem to die. So people apparently used to walk in his footsteps because they thought he was proof. So bit of a character. I just love, the audacious plans that he came up with. I'm going to get an old sub and I'm going to go to the North Pole, or I'm going to fly my aeroplane from Alaska to Norway and record what I see and chart all this territory. So he was a cool dude.
Yeah. Am I hearing that he's somewhat inspirational for you?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I like those guys who just, people say, you can't do that. And they go, oh, okay, I'll do it then. Yeah. And I definitely find that someone saying that can't be done is a bit of a red rag to me. The more people tell me it's impossible or it shouldn't be done or it can't be done, the more likely I am to give it a go maybe. So, yeah, I see a bit of inspiration from Hubert.
Yeah, cool. So along that line, I mean, every time I hear or speak of you to someone else, you're off to another location to explore some caves or something like that somewhere. I mean, what are you working on now? What current projects do you have going?
We've got a couple of things in the pipeline. We are going back to the Pearse Resurgence early next year to just have one last look.
Okay.
So we're down to 229 metres there, and there's two separate tunnels which we'd like to connect together. I'm not particularly interested in going any deeper, but there's some tunnels that could be connected just prior to that bottom part of the cave.
Right.
That cave still is heading in the opposite direction from where we know the water comes from, so there's a great deal of exploration to be done in there. We're going to go to Canada next year as well and explore a cave called Castleguard Cave, which is extremely well known over there. There's about 20 kilometres of dry cave in there. You have to visit there in winter because it has to be frozen to get in there safely. Otherwise, the snow melt is flooding out of the place.
Yep.
So Craig and I went and visited one of your countrymen, Tom Crisp, while he was living over there and did some caving with him. And he showed us how extraordinary the caves and the potential caves in Canada and Alberta are, and how lovely the Canadian cavers are. What an awesome bunch of people they are. Very tough indeed, and they really earn their caves. So we're going to go over there, and there's a sump in the Castleguard Cave, and beyond that sump, there's dry cave that's never been looked at. So that's the goal, is to try and check that out.
Awesome. And I remember Tom spoke to me about that. He actually did an episode with me some time ago. I think it was almost a year ago or last November or so. And he mentioned the challenges and the dives in those caves with the multi-level aspect of them, where you're going to significant depth and then having to come all the way back up before you went back down again. How do you manage a dive like that?
Yeah, well, Tom was very generous, actually. He basically took us to this cave and said he's gone as far as he felt comfortable at that stage of his career. So help yourself, boys. So we jumped in there and the cave went down to about 65 metres depth and then basically came back to the surface into a remote chamber. So, 65 metres, even 10 years ago, that would have seemed a very daunting dive to do that kind of profile and then do it backwards again.
Mm-hmm.
Without spending very much time in the distant chamber, because we didn't even get out of the water. It was a very poxy little small muddy chamber with a very steep muddy slope to get out. So we thought, no, it's just not worth it. We'll just float here for half an hour and then turn around and go back. So
right.
How do you plan for a dive like that? We pretty much rely on our computers and just add some conservatism to our profiles, particularly on the way home, and spend some more time than we need to in the shallows.
Yeah.
Touch wood, I think so far so good. But, I remember when they were exploring Junee Cave in Tasmania, in Australia, which is another cave that goes down to about 65 metres, then up to about 55 before there's a rock choke that no one's managed to get past. Mm-hmm. And that's the second sump in this cave. So, a mixed gas dive, second dive of the day, and then you've got to come back out and dive back out through the first sump, which is about 18 metres deep. So there was enormous paranoia about what was going to happen to these divers. There was no experience doing that sort of double sump deep dive, and they had all these plans of how long they needed to spend in the dry chambers and all the tables and things. And guys like David Dulett, they're very well-known decompression theorists, were involved in modelling it all and worrying about it. And I think it's turned out to not be the issue that we all thought. As long as you do the decompression and your computer remembers appropriately what the tissues are loaded with before you get into the next dive, then, it's like following the old tables around. If you come out as a D diver, just remember you are a D diver, and thank goodness for all these boffins who have worked all this out for us, because so far it just seems to be working. Yeah. So as long as you're sensible and you take some appropriate measures to be as conservative and careful as you can, then it seems to work most of the time.
Most of the time, yeah. It's always the caveat, right? Most of the time. Thomas Steiner used to tell us your computer doesn't get bent, you do. But at the same time, his philosophy was always what you said as well, which is if you can do some extra deco, do extra and be super conservative. I think we discussed in truck, you're just using Borman with gradient factors for that as well. We started with the VR3s and then we went to vPlanner when those computers became available, like the X1, the LiquaVision in particular was a great computer, particularly the form factor, nice small computer with very bright displays. As the eyes get older and tighter, that became important. And now the shear water products with gradient factors are what we use all the time, and we've just been incredibly happy with that stuff. It's totally reliable. I'm not saying it's bender-proof, but just the format, the interface and the simplicity and reliability we haven't found anything to beat it yet. No, and that's certainly what most of the divers I know dive, including myself. We talked about current projects. I mean, what are you planning for the future? Is it more of the same, or have you got some other things that are sort of a little different that you're planning?
Well, my attention is coming back to the filming and photography a little bit. That's sort of what my passion always was underwater, and I've neglected it a fair bit while I've been exploring. Mm-hmm. I've had this idea about cave diving documentary that I had pitched to people over the years, and they always thought, it sounds interesting, Harry, but go away and give it some more thought. Well, with this Australian of the Year thing, and now that our names are a bit better known, people have been returning my calls, I guess, for a while at least. And so whilst that's happening, I'm taking advantage of that and trying to repitch the ideas that I've had. So we're going to shoot some footage out on the Nullarbor to make a sizzle reel and use that to help pitch the documentary. As you may be well aware, finding that first bit of funding, just getting one person interested to actually commit to some money seems to be the first big obstacle. And when you're completely unknown as a director or the person in front of the camera, then, we need something in the can, as they say, to show people, to prove to them with hopefully it's a worthwhile concept. So that's what I'm thinking about a lot at the moment. And, with places like Castlegate in Canada and the Pearse Resurgence coming up, they would make really compelling viewing in my view. So fingers crossed I can just get that happening, and then that'll take care of the next year or two.
Yeah, and they're all super interesting sites and quite diverse as well, right? The Nullarbor being very distant 24-hour plus drive there, nowhere near civilization, taking everything with you, but in a desert, hot climate versus coming to New Zealand and diving 6-degree caves. I'm assuming it's quite similar in Canada, but colder going there in the winter.
Yeah, and the Pearse is not that far away from, Motueka and civilization, but it is a 20-minute ride in a helicopter into this valley with all the gear. So, it's 2.5 hours to walk out. So you are essentially in the middle of nowhere because the helicopter will only come in from 9 till 5 as long as it's light and it's not fogged in and it's not raining too hard. Mm-hmm. So, if you're bent in there, you want to be able to look after yourselves. And I guess that's the other caveat I would add to all my rather bold statements about, decompression and she'll be right, mate. We do take enormous precautions about being able to manage our own problems on site as far as we can.
Yep.
So I think before you start rushing into doing this stuff, you want to have thought about your exit plans pretty well. We're lucky to have a doctor and a vet, and all our team members, they're very experienced technical divers. They've all seen and experienced mild to moderate and occasionally severe decompression sickness. So there's a pretty good system in place for if someone gets a minor bend. Everyone knows what to do. Everyone takes it seriously. Mm-hmm. No one denies or hides their symptoms, I don't think. And, we're always prepared to put people back in the water or back in a habitat. Got all the gear to do that. We've got comprehensive first aid kits and communications and things. So we manage the risks as far as we can. Now, I'm not saying there still aren't some hazards there, but you need to have thought through all this stuff before you take the plunge.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I take that point really well. I mean, even at my level, going to truck with someone like Pete Mesley and having, a dive doctor there with you is exactly the sort of thing that we do at this level. And certainly as you take that further into your remote exploration, it's super important. So
Pete's trips are so well organised, and the way he does that, bring a doctor along who's really competent in dealing with critical emergencies and diving emergencies, makes those trips worth every cent.
Oh, yeah, exactly. I love it. It gives you the comfort. I mean, you want to do the dives there. You want to be able to do the ET and some of the other dives that are 65, 70 meters. But at the same time, because you're doing multi-day deep diving, decompression diving, it is just super important. And you never know when it might be your day. You do your best to plan around that. But having someone there is super important. So I love that. Well, mate, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I really appreciate your time. Yeah, as you and I said off mic, how busy you've become, and this is your only day off, I think, for some weeks. So to give us your time, again, as I said, I'm really appreciative. I know our audience out there will be super enthralled with what we've been through, and I sincerely look forward to your book coming out. So it's November the 5th. There's obviously a title for it. What's it going to be called?
It is, yes, Against All Odds. Just think of the Phil Collins song, which we didn't when we made the title, but now we have to.
And now that'll have to be the theme song for the movie as well, right?
That's right, yeah. No, it's been great to chat, Steve. Good to catch up. We've only scratched the surface, but...
Yeah, we'll definitely do another episode if you can give me your time, and we'll arrange that in the October-November timeframe to map with the book. And if anyone's looking for a book, I know I'm going to have my hand up as early as I can in the signed copy list, so don't forget that. I'll be waiting for it for Christmas.
We can help with that.
Thank you very much. And again, thanks for your time, and say hi to Fiona for me.
Okay. Cheers, mate. Bye.
Cheers.
Well, I hope you got as much out of that episode as I did. It was great to catch up with Harry and learn more about his diving and what it takes to be an explorer. Now, just a couple of housekeeping notes. If you're interested in more information about the fundamentals of sidemount diving, look out for my book. It's an ebook, Sidemount Fundamentals, available through my website, sidemountpros.com, in the store. And also, we still have space on the trip going to Truck Lagoon in June 2020. We have a great group of guys going sidemount diving. If you'd like to join us in Truck Lagoon on this absolute bucket list trip, then reach out to me or directly to Pete Mesley's Lust for Rust. Let him know you want to join Steve Davis's sidemount group, and we're going to have an absolute blast there in June next year. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
You've been listening to Speaking Sidemount from www.sidemountpros.com. If you like the podcast, please subscribe and consider leaving us a 5-star review. If there's something you'd like us to cover on the show, then let us know via our Facebook page listed in the podcast notes. Thanks again, and we look forward to you joining us on our next episode of Speaking Sidemount.